Welcome to Lesson 33. We're going to look at some additional rules that are applicable to all pharmacy practice locations. And we're going to be covering pages 177 through 185 in your book. So starting on page 177, we see the rule for centralized prescription filling. Both the rule and the statute are provided for you there. This is a practice that allows for some efficiency in pharmacy practice to allow a centralized pharmacy that's usually highly automated to handle normally just the refills for a pharmacy, but it's not restricted just to refills. The idea is that if you have multiple pharmacies in an area, so this generally is with chain pharmacies or a group of small pharmacies, where patients are going to get their refills but not pick them up till the next day. All the refills are transmitted to the central pharmacy, which is usually highly automated, and then they are shipped to each of the originating pharmacies where the patients will pick them up. So the pharmacies in the individual stores don't actually have to mess with the actual dispensing process. They just take the package when it comes from the central pharmacy, and that's given to the patient. So a couple of terminology here. We have the originating pharmacy is the pharmacy where the prescription was first filled, or where the patient's going to pick up the prescription. And then a central fill pharmacy is the one that actually is going to do the filling and ship it back to the originating pharmacy. So Florida laws allows this to be done by pharmacies that are under common ownership, or even if they're not under common ownership, you could contract with another central fill service to perform this on your behalf. As I mentioned, Florida is real big on policies and procedures. So to do this, guess what? You must have a policy and procedure manual, and there's specific information that must be included in the policy and procedure manual. So you can read those on letters A through I on page 177. Labeling is a little bit different when a prescription is filled by a central fill pharmacy. So both pharmacies have to be identified on the label. However, if you turn to page 178, the originating pharmacy, which remember that's the pharmacy where the patient's going to go pick up their prescription, they have to be identified by their name and address, just like they normally would. The central fill pharmacy can be identified on the label by some type of code, which makes sense because if you had two pharmacy names on there, it might be confusing, and two telephone numbers, and that could get confusing to the patient. But there's got to be some type of code, and this is really getting to record keeping and labeling, so that if there was an error, that they'll be able to know that this was not filled at that originating pharmacy location, but maybe at the central fill pharmacy location. So one of the questions that always comes up with central fill is can the central fill pharmacy send the medications directly to the patient, maybe via mail, rather than the patient having to go back to the originating pharmacy to pick up the prescription? And Florida laws allow the central fill pharmacy to do that for non-controlled substance prescriptions. So, however, DEA rules prohibit a central fill pharmacy from shipping drugs directly to the patient. And that's because DEA does allow this, but in order to do this, it's a different type of DEA registration. There's a pharmacy registration or dispenser registration that the originating pharmacy would have, but there's also a separate registration for a central fill pharmacy, and under that registration, a central fill DEA registrant is only allowed to send their drugs back to the originating pharmacy. They can't send it directly back to the patient. So on the bottom of page 178, we see a relatively new provision called the Prescription Drug Donation Repository Program, known as the Florida Rx Connects program. So this is a relatively new program. It was put into the Florida Pharmacy Act at 465.1902. However, the rules for this are not in the Board of Pharmacy rules because this program impacts not just pharmacies, but other areas as well. So it's actually administered by the Florida Department of Health, And this is a second donation program. Remember, we talked about the cancer drug donation program earlier. This one's different. This is allows donation of certain prescription drugs, and these are to be supplied to indigent, uninsured, or underinsured patients by creating a repository where people can donate these drugs. This one does not allow dispensed drugs to be donated, whereas remember the cancer one did allow a patient to donate dispensed drugs if they were in a closed delivery system. This one, excuse me, look at who the donors are or can be: nursing homes with closed drug delivery systems, hospices, hospitals with closed drug delivery systems, pharmacies, drug manufacturers, and wholesalers. So under this program, a repository is a location that can accept these donated drugs and dispense them to eligible patients. And there's all kinds of rules about who the eligible patients are. But if you notice the list of types of entities that can serve as a repository, included in there are pharmacies. And when I last checked in late 2022, there were only 12 repositories in the state, but most of them were pharmacies, because what you'll see later on is that pharmacists are required to inspect the donated drugs. So it kind of makes sense that the repositories are going to be places that have a pharmacist available. So as I mentioned, there are qualifications on who these drugs can be donated to. It's for indigent patients, and that is actually defined, but also uninsured or underinsured patients. And of course, they must have a valid prescription to get these particular donated drugs. You'll see on page 180 as you read through this that there are obligations that if a pharmacy is serving as a repository by the 5th of each month, patients have to apply. They have to fill out an application, but then by the 5th of each month, the repository would have to send a summary of each patient's application and the dispensing form as well. And then, as I mentioned on top of page 181, letter M, when donations are received, a pharmacist has to inspect the donation to ensure that it meets all the requirements, and all those requirements for the donated drugs are listed in number 6 on page 181, and actually going over to 182, you can read through all the specific requirements just to make sure that the drugs have not been tampered or adulterated in some way. There are some limitations on which drugs can be donated. You'll see that in number 5 on page 181. It cannot be any controlled substances. It can't be cancer drugs because those have a different donation program that we talked about earlier. And also can't be drugs that are stored other than at controlled room temperatures. It can't be drugs that require refrigeration or freezing or something like that. And also, letter 5D is interesting. Any drug that's subject to a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, a REMS program, and remember there are quite a few of those, is not eligible for donation under this program. You'll see on page 182 there are requirements for inspection of the drugs. They've got to be quarantined until a pharmacist actually inspects them. There are record-keeping requirements. As you can imagine, you'll see the record-keeping requirements. An inventory has got to be kept of all the donated drugs in letter 7D on page 182. Each repository must also have a protocol for notifying all patients in this program if a prescription drug that was donated and then dispensed to them has been recalled. So you have to have a recall process as explained on the bottom of page 182 and over to page 183. There is immunity from liability for participants in this program, which is a good thing, and you can read about that on the top of page 183. Okay, a couple additional rules that apply to every location. The first one here is transfer of drugs upon a change of ownership. If you're going to sell a pharmacy and transfer your inventory to them, you have to provide this transfer information to the Board of Pharmacy, you must complete an inventory of all your controlled substances. And don't forget your Schedule II transfers have to be done, even though if they're not physically moving, they have to be transferred to the new owner using a DEA 222 form. The next rule requires that all outdated, damaged, or misbranded or adulterated drugs in the pharmacy have to be removed or quarantined and taken out of your active stock. Now, this rule used to have a time that it had to be done every 4 months or every 3 months or something like that. That language is taken out several years ago. It just says you have to remove them. It doesn't say you have to check it every day or every week or whatever like that. But you should not have any outdated pharmaceuticals in your active inventory at your pharmacy. We mentioned this a couple times in the controlled substance chapter, but there is a statutory provision in Florida that prohibits the promotion or sale or advertising of any controlled substances. There's a couple other rules in the statute that require pharmacies to make information available on their website. I call these website disclosures. And a lot of it gets into cost, what the cost of services are. So this was from a law that was passed. It applies to all licensed healthcare facilities, and pharmacies fall under it. I'm not sure how helpful it is in a pharmacy situation, but it does apply to pharmacies, so you should read through this section. On your website, you're supposed to have a hyperlink to this information at the Agency for Healthcare Administration. And it's supposed to allow patients to price shop for healthcare services. So, I mean, I can see it becoming, especially if you're paying cash, being valuable if you're going to compare someplace you're going to go to get an MRI maybe, or a CT scan at some of these freestanding facilities versus a hospital or something like that. But it's supposed to allow price comparison, and just realize that pharmacies fall under this particular provision. So I wanted to include it in the book and also in the course. So on top of page 184, we've mentioned this before as well, but this is the actual rule that says that only one entity or one corporation or one partnership or one business can obtain a pharmacy permit at one location. You can't have two different entities running two different operations at the same location. And remember, a single location there, they have to be a contiguous area under the control of whoever owns the permit, but it can't be more than a half mile from the central location. There's another rule that says rebates, statute and rule that talks about rebates being prohibited. Basically, as you can't accept any kickbacks, bonuses, or any kind of split fee arrangement where you're paying a prescriber or anyone to refer patients to your pharmacy to have their prescriptions filled. The rule actually gives specific examples of that, such as providing equipment or supplies, to like a nursing home or something like that, and with the expectation that I'm going to give you these items for free, with the expectation that you're going to get all the business from that particular facility. And finally, there's a requirement that pharmacies post in their pharmacy a notification regarding human trafficking. There was also a continuing education requirement that went along with this, but that's already been completed. It was a one-time thing that pharmacists had to do. But the requirement for this sign, and you can see the words that have to be in the sign, apply to all pharmacies as well. So you can read that on page 184 and over to page 185. And that is the conclusion of this particular lesson, and we'll pick up again on page 185 talking about pharmacist orders for medicinal drugs.